Now, since it's all about giving us, the developers, more flexibility and extensibility to create a system per se of classes that are customizable and easy to follow, of course, right? And not having classes that are duplicating code and so forth. There's also a very important component when it comes to inheritance in Java. So if we look at our class here, as we instantiate, we have the manager, we even have the employee as we created before. So we have this relationship with the manager and employee and the person, okay? Now, the interesting thing here is that as you saw, everything that we do, for instance, if I come here and say manager dot get first name or get ID or get annual salary or whatever it is, we are getting things from the parent class, meaning that this get annual here, as you can see, it's from employee class, even though I'm a manager. So there's nothing that will prevent me, because remember, we want to create a system that is not dependent on every other class out there, but there is this symbiotic relationship there, meaning we want to be flexible. So if you come to manager here, since as you see, it extends employee, we can actually do what we call the overriding of certain actions, right? Because if we want, for instance, to say, well, as the manager, even though a manager is also an employee, but in this case, it's not the employee at a lower level. I know this sounds horrible, but you know what I mean, right? So there is always a hierarchy. We want to make sure that it's this manager here. When we get the salary, we want to also say the salary that this manager is getting is different from just an employee salary. So in this case here, we need to override, of course, the get salary method, right? Action that we are inheriting from employee. To do that, we're going to say public get salary, and it's already there. Now, here's the cool thing. It says here M, we know what that stands for. M stands for method. It is indeed a method, but there's just an O here and this arrow shooting up. This means this has to be an override because it's going to be get annual salary, which is what we want. We could have used something else. The difference here is that we are getting the get annual salary, but in order for us to create a method, get annual salary, it has to be overridden because that is the idea. We want this get salary here to be customizable to the manager only here. So if I do enter like that, right, with help with our great IDE here, you notice that everything is written for us. But the most important, we have this annotation here that says at override. This is very important. And you can see there's this O that we saw before that just says it's override. Overriding what? It's overriding what is the main class, get annual, which will be for us here the employee class. So now it says return super get annual. What is this super? Well, the super is going to be the employee, right? So in this case here, we're saying it's going to return what the get annual salary is for the parent class, the super class, the main class, right? But that's not what we want, because that's the behavior that we're getting. So the behavior we want is that we want to return our own get salary. So in this case here, because I want to give something different to get annual salary, because I know it's returning a double here, I could just add, for instance, another $1,000 or $10,000 like that. All right. Now check this out. I'm going to save this. Let's go to my class again where we're doing everything. Notice every time I say manager.set salary, we're going to set the salary like we have done before, but now it's going to change. Because manager here is $45,000. Let's see what's going to happen. Let's save this and run. Aha! Now manager George is getting $55,000, but we set the salary here to be $45,000. What happens? Well, you know exactly what happened, because we said, well, the time that we are calling our get annual salary, what are we doing actually? We're not going to go and use the employee get salary. We are going to use our get annual salary because we are going to override our get annual salary from our parent employee and add another $10,000 to it. So now we are even further doing customizations to our class so that in runtime, it's going to come in, say manager. Okay, manager gets from employee. That's great. And all that stuff. But hey, wait a minute. It gets everything from our employee because it extends it. However, whenever it runs the get annual salary, we're not just going to go and use the super get annual salary, meaning our employee annual salary. We're going to get that, but we are also going to add another $10,000. Why? Because George indeed is the manager, right? Does it make sense? So there is another customization here. So every time now we say manager.getSalary, it's never going to go and get this salary here, the annual salary. Nope. It's going to go ahead and run this override annual salary. So it's going to replace the get annual salary and run this one here, which we said, okay, we're going to call the get annual salary, but we're going to add another 10,000. And voila, we have that. Of course, we can do that with anything else, right? We can go ahead and say public. We can go ahead and say the ID. To get the ID, we're going to use the super ID, and we're going to append another 100 to the ID. That way, whenever we're getting ID for any manager, it's not going to get the ID from our employee. It's going to get the ID from our employee, but we're going to also add 100 to it so that it's a differentiated. In fact, if we save this, come down here again and say plus ID. I'm going to say manager.get ID, run. You're going to see now ID is 556, but we set ID to be 456. So we added 100, it's going to be 500. And there we go. That proves to us that we are indeed using the override methods that we created inside of Manager to differentiate this manager from the employee. Now, here's how I like to think of this, because this can be a little bit complicated at first. Think of your parents, right? You inherited a lot of things from your parents. Now, physiologically speaking, in terms of anatomy, there's a lot of things that obviously you've inherited from your mom and dad, and of course, your dad from their parents and so forth, right? But when it comes to behaviors, even though you came from your parents, it doesn't mean that all of your parents' behaviors are going to be yours, right? Because that would be just a very robotic, per se, a world where, well, if my dad used to sneeze really loudly, everybody in my family was going to sneeze loudly as well, right? So those are behaviors that you can override. So you can say, for instance, that I will not sneeze as loud as my mom, right? So that is a behavior. You are overriding the behavior you got from your parents. Now you want to have your own behavior. But the calling of that behavior, for instance, sneeze would be the behavior or the action. It's going to be the same. So if you were a class, an object, it can say James, supposedly that's your name. So James.sneeze, you're going to sneeze. However, when you invoke the sneeze method, it's not going to call your parents' sneeze method, right? You can override it and call your own. That is what we're talking about here. So even though you are part of your parents, you've inherited everything from your parents, you can change and add other attributes or properties or fields or instance variables as well as behaviors on top of that. And that, my friend, is what we continue talking about, the object-oriented programming, because now you can see the things we can do with our classes. They all work together. We can get things from other parent classes as we want them, but we can override them. We can also add more things that we want for our own, and we create a solid system that way. It's always very exciting, folks. I don't know if you can tell when I talk about this, the enthusiasm that comes with all of this, because it just makes sense and it's such a beautiful thing. And I hope you find it a beautiful thing. If not, continue watching these videos, go back to the previous videos, because this, I understand, this concept can be a little bit shaken. And I hope this is helping you to demystify this object-oriented programming, this classes and object, all of that. So if you think in terms of analogy, I believe that really helps you to solidify this knowledge that you're trying to grasp. All right, play with this concept, folks. What I want you to do is actually, if you want, add other properties here, other instance variables for the manager that you think will be good just for the manager. Just think outside the box and play around with this. You can also create other methods, other actions, instead of just overriding them if you want for the manager. All right, perfect. I'll see you next.